Hi everybody, and welcome to Week 14's mini lectures. We're almost to the end of the course, but these final 2 weeks of material and of history are quite critical to our understanding of American history. As we've seen, Herbert Hoover was no stranger to managing crisis. Despite much criticism, both at the time and to the present, Hoover did not sit idly by and wait for the Depression to solve itself. He instituted a broad swath of top-down economic programs, but he still emphasized that the federal government would not provide direct relief to the suffering citizens of the United States. While the New Deal is overall attributed to his successor, FDR, Hoover instituted many of the programs that later became the keystones of the New Deal. But the economy kept its downward slide, however. It reached its lowest points in 1931 to 33, precisely as the US was conducting a presidential election cycle, and we all know how much fun those could be. Before Thanksgiving week, we discussed the state of the US's economy and environment, with the trifecta of disasters profoundly affecting the people. In the forums, some of you brought up the 2008 crash, which has many parallels, including an election cycle in the midst of economic calamity. Another parallel election could be 1976's contest between Ford and Carter, where Carter aimed to revive the U.S. economy from its, quote, stagflation malaise. Economic uncertainty often benefits the party out of power, and this was especially true in the case of the 1932 election. Herbert Hoover had tried every policy in his playbook, and at this point, private charity was exhausted while people still were suffering. Hoover still had faith in the American character, as he tried to define it, and believed that with some belt-tightening, the U.S. would recover. However, homeless encampments sprang up across the U.S. named Hoovervilles, and Hoover was widely viewed as being out of touch with the scope and scale of the disaster. In competition, the Democratic Party ran Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, an old money New Yorker crippled by polio. FDR had a long career in politics, beginning in the New York State Senate and moving upward from there. He had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I and had been the vice presidential candidate in 1920. After that loss, FDR began experiencing symptoms of polio, which disabled him and bound him to a wheelchair. Any instance of FDR standing, especially giving speeches, was a staged event, as he could stand in his braces but had to be helped into place. FDR became governor of New York in 1928, and in 1932 won the Democratic nomination to challenge Hoover. The media helped hide FDR's ailment, and Hoover refused to allow his campaign to attack FDR based on his infirmity. However, the presidential campaign quickly got ugly in the midst of the Depression, and the nation had largely tired of Hoover's attempts to fix the economy. FDR won an overwhelming 57% of the popular vote, and as you can see by the map in the middle, 89% of the Electoral College. He swept pretty much the entire nation except for a few states in the Northeast. Hoover was out, FDR was in. FDR continued and expanded many of the policies initially instituted by Hoover, and the economy began to recover. However, FDR also instituted broad swaths of economic and monetary policy fixes, attempting to tweak the economy and aid recovery. These policies reflected the ideas of the British economist John Maynard Keynes, whose book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, remains one of the most influential works of economic theory of the 20th century. Effectively, Keynes argued that the governments needed to regulate the economy through monetary policy and that this could be done by shifting interest rates and massive government spending for public works. The possibility for Keynes was for a massive government spending program to reduce unemployment, pay the unemployed for any job they could find or create, whether it was digging ditches or taking pictures of said ditch diggers, or building infrastructure projects, or however. Federal investment in a jobs program would be one of the keys to extricating the U.S. from the Depression. Keynes wrote what I consider one of the two most important letters of the 20th century to the new chief executive of the United States. In his letter to FDR, he argued that the disaster facing the U.S. was among the most profound in world history and advocated for, quote, an overwhelming emphasis on the increase in national purchasing power resulting from government expenditure, which is financed by loans and not taxing present incomes. Nothing else counts in comparison with this. In a boom, inflation can be caused by allowing unlimited credit to support the excited enthusiasm of business speculators. But in a slump, government loan expenditure is the only sure way of securing quickly a rising output at rising prices. In the past, orthodox finance has regarded a war as the only legitimate excuse for creating employment by government expenditure. You, Mr. President, having cast off such fetters, are free to engage in the interests of peace and prosperity, the technique which has hitherto only been allowed to serve the purposes of war and destruction. In other words, John Maynard Keynes, among the most prominent and progressive economists out of Britain, was arguing that FDR turned the spending dial to full and spend broadly to drive the American economy out of the Depression. The U.S. government would become a major employer, and the scope and character of the U.S. government would be profoundly changed. The proof was in the pudding. When the U.S. government reduced spending in 1937, the unemployment rate jumped 5 points. And when World War II broke out, military Keynesianism brought the nation to full employment and led to an unprecedented period of economic growth after World War II, which historians are now calling the Great Acceleration. The major policy of FDR's recovery was the New Deal. The New Deal consists of what I like to call the alphabet soup of recovery programs, some of which, like Social Security, persist today. I'll cover a few of the more important programs, but there were dozens of them, and they can be broadly divided into the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. Relief programs aimed at the immediate amelioration of the conditions of the unemployed. Through direct aid, jobs programs, and through agricultural relief. It consisted of public works investment, such as the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was a program to employ young men in cutting trails, constructing buildings, making roads, and other manual labor to put people to work on the U.S.'s public lands and in its national parks. Many of the most famous lodges in our national parks are products of the CCC, as are miles upon miles of trails, roads, and other improvements to the public lands. The Works Progress Administration, or the WPA, was another program. The Civilian Conservation Corps had worked well at reducing the number of discontented and desperate young men by giving them stuff to do and sending some of their wages to their families. And it was quickly expanded into the Works Progress Administration, which employed men and women. The WPAA built dams, airports, roads, and massive infrastructure, putting people to work. Think about LaGuardia Airport in New York City, the Hoover Dam in Nevada, and the Bellevue Dam in Washington State. Those are WPA projects. But it also employed artists and authors to document and glorify these projects, and some of its art became famous in a genre of its own, as you can see by this poster celebrating the new municipal airports constructed by the New Deal. The New Deal, or the Works Progress Administration, electrified the rural areas of the country, bringing light and heat to people who never dreamed that their homes would be lit with electric lights. And it hired writers to record interviews with formerly enslaved African Americans who had survived to the Depression. And it created an amazing archive of the lived experience of former chattel slaves. The other relief programs included agricultural relief policy. The Dust Bowl and clouds of locusts had given agricultural America quite the post-apocalyptic vibe, and farm foreclosures exacerbated this. To forestall the rolling disasters in the agricultural sector, Congress created the Agricultural Adjustment Administration to regulate crop prices and supplies through purchasing agricultural products and paying farmers to let their fields lay fallow and not produce, driving down the agricultural production of the country and bringing prices up. While it was later found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, the Agricultural Adjustment Act helped plug the hole in the agricultural economy. In the American South, the Tennessee Valley Authority worked to electrify and modernize the Tennessee Valley through dam construction and other policies. While the TVA is certainly responsible for bringing electricity to the Tennessee Valley, it was criticized for its heavy-handedness, often displacing people from their homes in the areas to be flooded as reservoirs. Following the dissolution of the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, the U.S. government further implemented the Farm Security Agency as a means of resettling farmers who lived on marginal land. It provided a lot of loans and grants to help folks keep their new farms or to move to more productive lands. And it also had one of the most famous programs of the New Deal, the Photographers of the FSA, which included Dorothea Lange. Her famous migrant mother photo is among the most famous out of the Depression. On the recovery end of things, the National Recovery Administration, or NRA, attempted to put a floor on the deflationary economic crisis. Both wages and prices had been plummeting, and so people who earned nothing could similarly buy nothing, which exacerbated the deflation. However, the NRA was found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, but FDR and Congress remedied that and moved to another program and passed the Wagner Act, which also created the National Labor Relations Board and codified the rights of workers to unionize, work an 8-hour day, and it banned child labor. The Wagner Act was among the culminating pieces of legislation of the long struggle of working people to be able to organize for better wages and working conditions, a struggle that we saw in Ludlow and elsewhere, and one that working people fought and died for. Finally, reform programs included banking regulations and federal intervention into the markets. These programs included the Glass-Steagall Act, which restricted how banks could invest their holdings. They also passed a high marginal tax rate. Incomes over a certain threshold were taxed at a very high rate, leading rich Americans to call FDR, quote, a traitor to his class. Congress also created a safety net for its elderly population. Today we know this as Social Security. The idea was that old people should not have to die in poverty or labor until their last breaths. A side effect of these social safety nets, providing some income for older people, had the effect of opening jobs for younger people, further pushing down unemployment for workers of prime age. It was also aimed at spurring consumption. Give grandma and grandpa some cash, stick them in an automobile, and have them go visit the kids and relatives elsewhere. What are they going to do? They're going to spend the money, creating demand for all sorts of stuff, like roadside motels, restaurants, gas stations, kitschy tourist crap, and other stuff, aka jobs. Proof of the efficacy of the New Deal came first in 1937, when FDR and Congress eased back on the New Deal programs. You can see the little bump right here, the slump right here. As FDR did, unemployment shot back up. It jumped about 5 points, I think from like 13 to 20 or something. But final proof really came with the Second World War. Massive spending in the wartime economy dropped unemployment to near zero. It's been rightly called military Keynesianism, where the principles of Keynes's theories, namely massive government spending on public programs, met the might of the military-industrial complex. That'll wrap up this first mini lecture, and I'll see you in the next one.